Hello everyone, this is Andre's Restart, and this time we're talking about The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom, and how this game is looking like the ultimate treat for Zelda fans apparently. And when I say Zelda fans, I mean across the board, the different types of Zelda fans. The Zelda fans that love Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. The Zelda fans that hate Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. The Zelda fans that prefer 2D top-down Zelda as opposed to 3D Zelda. It looks like Echoes of Wisdom is going to be bringing us all together. How so? Well, that's what we're speaking more on today. But before going forward, let me ask that if you do enjoy my content, to please subscribe and hit that notification bell. So as we've gotten more and more information on this game, I've kind of felt like The Legend of Zelda Echoes of Wisdom is indeed a bit of a hybrid. Now, when I say that, what I'm getting at here is that Echoes of Wisdom certainly has a lot of elements that's carrying over from Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, but also is bringing back a lot of elements from prior traditional Zelda games. Some examples. When looking at the abilities and how Zelda interacts with the world, that's definitely the Breath, Tears sort of format, or at least thinking, where you have these abilities that have a wide variety of application. And the manner in which you interact with the world, well, there's quite a bit you can do there. And also even the level of elevation. Seeing Zelda being able to run up trees and such, that's not something we would have expected in any prior 2D top-down kind of Zelda game. But we see all of these elements in Echoes of Wisdom. It seems to carry that philosophy of open air. And I use the terminology open air as opposed to open world because I think there is a difference. Nintendo has used the term open air to describe Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, and these games are open world, these massive worlds that you can explore however you choose, with a great deal of freedom, and essentially once you get past the beginning moments of those games, you can do whatever you want. That's kind of open world, but the open air element is more suggestive of the level of freedom in terms of how you interact with the world, not just progression structure. That's how I interpreted it, because open world was already an established concept before Breath and Tears, but with Breath of the Wild, everything else it introduced is what made it so revolutionary. Being able to scale every single mountain you can see, being able to fly through all the airspace you can see, in theory. Being able to interact with the world and having all these advanced physics and weather systems in mind that allow for great amounts of variation with the gameplay. To me, that's what they meant by open air. And then looking at Echoes of Wisdom, it has a lot of that. We've talked about in the past how Echoes of Wisdom seems to be built off that 2D Zelda prototype we saw in the making of Breath of the Wild. And when looking at things like how fire burns in the world, it seems very, very similar. And these elements, in all honesty, are what I'm most excited about for Echoes of Wisdom, because what I love most about Breath and Tears, the amount of freedom you have in terms of how you choose to interact with the world. When talking about how the Zelda series has evolved over the last decade or so, I think it's these elements that are most important. And so I clarify on that because there are things about prior Zelda games that I do think should make a comeback in some way. And I've made the argument in the past that Tears of the Kingdom was already starting to do a little bit of that. The dungeons having more pronounced themes, bringing back epic boss fights. These things were improvements over what we saw in Breath of the Wild in my opinion, and I also felt from a storytelling perspective they improved in a lot of ways. Sure, there's some debate in terms of structure, but in terms of voice acting and the scenes that we saw, there were definitely improvements there. And so I've been optimistic that with future Zelda games we'll see them bring back even more elements from traditional Zelda games, and with Echoes of Wisdom that seems to be quite apparent. From the demos that we've gone recently, we've now learned that dungeons pretty much work the way they worked in the past, at least with the very first dungeon of the game. There is a boss key chest you will search throughout the dungeon to eventually get to the final boss, and there is a big epic final boss. But also the map system looks more like prior Zelda dungeons. And there's also a mini boss with an item that you obtain that gives you better ability to progress throughout the dungeon. And so there are some huge implications here. Will future dungeons work in the same way? Because if they do, then there may be some limitation on progression, unlike Breath and Tears. Now maybe the way things have been designed, the progression simply is based off each particular dungeon. So in the case of this first dungeon that's shown off in the different demos that people got to play for Echoes of Wisdom, the Southern Ruins, Princess Zelda eventually fights Dark Link or some sort of evil version of Link and obtains a sword that gives her the Sword Fighter mode. And the Sword Fighter mode allows her to hack through these purple goop things. Maybe that's simply an element for that particular dungeon that halts progression until you obtain that ability. And the sword ability is simply just useful throughout the world. But there won't be anything in the overworld that will be holding you back with the abilities you have. In theory, you can figure out multiple ways to progress throughout all of it. However, when inside the dungeons, there may be other abilities that you may need to complete that particular dungeon, and then you can use that ability outside the overworld to give you more options, but you don't necessarily need it to get to other parts of the map. That might be the middle ground we're looking at here in terms of open world progression and structure, but also having some level of linearity. Now we still don't know fully exactly how things are going to work. It does seem like we have a lot of freedom in terms of how we can progress, but from what we've seen so far, the beginning moments of the game are fairly linear. There's the opening sequence with Link, then there's Princess Zelda exploring the dungeons of Hyrule Castle, then there's where she escapes that eventually leads you to the first dungeon of the game. What happens after that point, we're unsure. I've operated under the assumption that with all of Zelda's abilities, we're probably going to be able to go wherever we please. But I do think it's worth mentioning that they may try to limit progression in certain ways by having these different rifts littered throughout the map. And that may steer you in certain directions or just truly limit you from going to some parts of the world until you clear out these rifts, thus unlocking other parts of the map that allow you to explore further. This is possible, but I suppose it's also worth mentioning that with the wide variety of abilities that Zelda has, she may be able to find creative ways to get around some of these rifts to go to different parts of the map. This part still remains uncertain, but the overall sentiment from what we're hearing from different people who have played Echoes of Wisdom and gone to play those first 80 minutes or so, is that this game shares elements from both styles of Zelda, and it's creating somewhat of a hybrid here. So for those that are concerned that this game won't feel like Zelda, there's a lot here that feels a lot like Zelda. Even going beyond the mechanics, we've seen so many different characters and things that are clearly references to prior Zelda games, and that is certainly nice to see as a longtime Zelda fan. So I feel that we're in for a real treat here, and we're just a few weeks away from the release of this game. And the more and more we see, the better and better it looks. But what do you think? Are you excited for Echoes of Wisdom? And why might that be? Let me know in the comments below. This is Andres Restart. Thank you so much for listening and watching, and I'll see you all really soon. Take care. Bye.